Well, let's bring Mark Anderson on screen because, of course, if we start to talk about plans for global change and global cities, that is clearly something that's also being linked with the war in Ukraine. But Mark, what have you got to tell us about the Pritzker Forum?
What's interesting here is that I was looking into the Pritzker Forum as a routine follow-up news item for today's UKC News. As an extension of what I did on the Alternative View program, I did the more enlarged program on global cities and smart cities. And I determined here, Pritzker Forum Global Cities, hey, there it is, September 20 through 22 this year in Chicago. And I think, oh, okay, they're a little bit delayed in getting back to this. And then I started looking at it more. Let's go to the next slide. And we see democracy in the life of cities, and it's a report. So then I open that report. We can move on to the next visual. And here's the democracy in the life of cities stemming from my routine perusal of what's going on with the Global Cities Forum. And I notice it's the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the main promoter of global cities in the U.S., and the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. And by the time you read that report, then you find this, we're going on, and we find toward a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, linked with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which has been in existence since 1972. It's 1 year older than the Trilateral Commission, and the German Marshall Fund has meetings that are not unlike Bilderberg, with private and public sector getting together in very questionable ways. But so what we find out is that Ukraine is in the crosshairs of the globalist establishment like never before. And they are going to bring the full brunt of global power to completely rework the social and energy and political and economic structure of Ukraine. Ukraine is being completely engineered. And that's what we're finding out. For instance, here we have cities and CSOs are willing to act. This is part of the German Marshall Fund's plans and things like that. There's a program that the slides coming up will show that there's a program coming up in London this week that actually moves forward on this. We're going a little too quick here on the slides, but this is talking about the EU's mission for climate neutral and smart cities is a Green Deal flagship initiative that supports efforts in more than 100 European cities to become climate neutral by 2030, 2 decades ahead of the bloc's 2050 target. As both major emitters and centers of innovation, cities have what it takes to lead on Europeans' decarbonization. Ukraine's ambition to build back green could greatly benefit from pursuing from pursuing a similar approach. And this gets into a further explanation. Local and civic efforts. Next slide, please. Local and civic efforts are driving the emergence of a distributed energy architecture in Ukraine. While this new system is in its early days and far from formalized, with the right support, it could become a testing ground and model for Europe's energy transition. So Ukraine's being looked at as a model for that purpose. And we'll go on from there. Much could be said here. I'll cut to the chase. The middle paragraph of this, starting here, the cost of Ukraine's reconstruction, they're already planning Ukraine's reconstruction even as the war goes on, has grown to $411 billion, according to the World Bank's latest estimate. Future-oriented loans, grants, and investments in the country's recovery will turn the unprecedented spending into an opportunity to green an economy that had been one of Europe's most energy and carbon intensive, putting it on track for European Union integration and global climate goals. So European Union integration of Ukraine is going hand in hand with making Ukraine's cities global cities, with making them build back green, with major investments likely that will come from BlackRock. That's not specified here, but I suspect that's true. Anyway, going to the middle paragraph in this slide, Ukraine will be able to join and compete in an EU economy fit for 55 only if cross-sectoral decarbonization goals that mirror the holistic approach of the EU's Green Deal guide EU's Green Deal guide the recovery process. The Lugano Declaration on the Reconstruction of Ukraine recognizes this and commits to rebuilding in alignment with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So you can see what's happening here. This is pretty disturbing and pretty dramatic. Let's look at the Lugano Declaration briefly moving forward.
Mark, if I may, just before you do that, just to come in very quickly,
Yeah,
what an extraordinary coincidence that as we have Ukraine being devastated with this war and smashed to piece, this is a wonderful opportunity for these people to see that they can take over the Ukrainian society and government and use it for a model country, a model nation state in this system. This is an amazing coincidence that it should have cropped up at the same time as the war.
Yes, coincidence with quotes around it. In my opinion, a quick opinion note, this is the real war on Ukraine, where we're looking at the complete social engineering or re-engineering, again, of their economic and social and political order. And it's all being done before the shooting has even stopped. So it makes you wonder why the shooting even started. What really happened, right? The action is in the reaction, which is so common among these oligarchs that run the think tanks and work and interact with the big bankers and the whole governance system that is controlling the regular governments of the world. Now, as we move on in this slide, these are all materials from my Global Cities research, as I mentioned. This slide is where I look in the corner. It says there's the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and that's happening in 2 days from now, right there in London, UK. And I'm not sure of the exact location, but everything I'm talking about is going to be brainstormed at this conference this week. Briefly, we'll touch on those Lugano principles in this next slide. Some of this is quite tiresome, and we've heard it a million times before, but we need to report it. Partnership, that's number one. Number two, reform focus. Number three, transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. Yeah, the tyranny and the one world dictatorship is becoming more visible and transparent. I guess that makes it less unpleasant. Number four, democratic participation. Number five, multi-stakeholder engagement, more globalese, meaningless words. Gender equality and inclusion, even more meaningless. And sustainability, what does that even mean? So you have your typical buzzwords and buzz concepts, you might say, that are going into this. And here we go. This is where it's more clear in the chain of information that I found last night. On June 21, 22, that's a couple days from now, the UK jointly with Ukraine will host the International Ukraine Recovery Conference in London. And so I don't know if we could get somebody over there, if they'd let somebody from UK column in. I'm not sure we'd be real welcome. But we can just kind of move on through this relatively quickly. In this next slide, notice what it says. It's early here, guys. The Ukraine Recovery Conference is dedicated to Ukraine's transformation and was symbolically launched in London in 2017 as the Ukraine Reform Conference. Now, this is curious that this has been going on in between when the West, through Victoria Nuland, overthrew the Russian-leaning leader of Ukraine in 2014. 3 years later, 2017, they're already doing these sorts of things well before the conflict that we're reporting on now. And as part of the 2023 agenda, it says here the conference will advance private sector participation in recovery by showcasing new and existing partnerships between international and Ukrainian businesses and the benefits these bring to both parties. A focus on specific sectors such as tech, logistics, and transport corridors, green energy, natural resources, infrastructure, reconstruction, digitalization, agriculture, and food, health, and pharmaceuticals will enable Ukraine to highlight investment opportunities and encourage future partnerships and areas of cooperation, which is really another way of saying they're going to open it up to the financial sharks of the world, very most likely BlackRock, major banks, major investors, probably Palantir and many that are involved in Bilderberg. Um, and here we get into the specifics of the Ukraine Recovery Conference coming up in London in a couple of days. They are being somewhat open about it, and yet the press in the UK and the US probably will never even touch this, never even mention that this is happening. They're going to deal with infrastructure, supporting Ukraine, rebuilding its damaged critical infrastructure, is an immediate need, but also offers opportunities for partnerships to shape efforts to rebuild and enhance facilities through using innovative technology and green solutions. AI will no doubt be a big part of it. Reform and governance matters to help Ukraine meet the standards required for EU accession. So we see what the end game is here. And participants and level of representation. The conference will be attended by high-level international political representatives from all regions, multilateral organizations, and international financial institutions. So that's what's going to be happening here in London in a couple of days at this Ukraine Recovery Conference. Moving on from there, again, this is very curious. As you look at that website, you see Ukraine reform conferences have been happening since 2017 in London, 2018 Copenhagen, 2019 Toronto, Canada, 2021 Vilnius, and 2022 Lugano. So Ukraine has been, you might say, a political, social, economic object of experiment for several years. Under the tutelage of the oligarchs and the internationalist establishment. And that is probably the bulk of the report. I believe that that's everything of major importance. And anyway, I'll just mention that Chatham House, this is worth the honorable mention. Chatham House simultaneously starting tomorrow is having a program called Shaping the New Ukraine, Delivering Resilient Recovery. And it's going to be live streamed. They say that the in-person seats are all taken up. And Ukraine's recovery, listen to this, requires enormous human and financial resources and will impact every sphere of public life.
Mark,
So,
thank you very much
yeah,
for that update. Very useful and just fascinating to see all this machinery go on in the backdrop while the war is still going on. And as we've seen with the statistics, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians dying.